Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Audible, and it contains spoilers for Joker. When I release this, Joker will have been out for less than a week, but somehow I feel a little late to the party. The movie has been discussed constantly for what feels like months online. The film itself almost felt like an afterthought to the controversy, the memes, the backlash to the controversy, whatever. But I'm gonna try to push all of that aside for a few minutes and discuss Joker as a movie, and how it warps and recontextualizes the Batman franchise. So once you move past all the controversy that almost certainly drove this thing to a bigger box office haul, how does it stand up as a piece of filmmaking? The short answer, I think, is pretty well. I have my problems with the film, which I'll go over in a bit, but taken as a whole, I think Joker is a great looking movie containing some very good performances, with a bit more on its mind than the sad man turns evil narrative that I was expecting. It's a movie that examines Gotham City from an angle we've never seen before, but to do that, it uses a few older films as its models. Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy. Made in the late 70s and early 80s, around when Joker is set, both of those films, and especially Taxi Driver, do a great job at painting a portrait of a desperate New York City that feels ready to boil over at any moment. It's a very specific kind of uncomfortable tone, and Joker does a really great job at capturing it here. Outside of the 60s TV show, Gotham City is almost always depicted as a pretty terrible place to live. From the over-the-top gothic neo-noir of the Burton movies to the near police state of the Nolan films. But what Joker gives us is a huge shift in perspective. We no longer see the city from the perspective of the billionaire Bruce Wayne, his powerful villains, or even the police, like in the great comic Gotham Central. We're seeing it from the point of view of one of its most disadvantaged and discarded residents. And that flip in perspective gives us a Gotham that feels totally unlike what's come before in a Batman movie, even if it is maybe a little too Scorsese derivative at times. And at the center of that is Arthur Fleck. And I'll just say, this is a character who doesn't really feel like the Joker to me. That may sound like a huge criticism, but I don't really mean it to be, at least not fully. There's been a lot of takes on the Joker, but one through line in most of them is just how meticulous he is. Though he claims not to be much of a planner in The Dark Knight, that really couldn't be farther from the truth. For someone who constantly plays up how unhinged he is, he's actually very good at predicting the reactions of others and planning around them. His actual emotions, his rage and anger, are generally buried under a few layers of detached silliness. Now, this is a very broad generalization of a character that's been reinterpreted in many different ways, so these aren't hard and fast rules or anything, but they are usually how I think of the character. Arthur Fleck is not that, at all. In Joker, Arthur is far from a criminal mastermind. The first real crime he commits is a completely spontaneous event, one that the police are closing in on him for pretty quickly. He's not a man with a plan, or even a purposeful message. For most of the film, he's a purely reactive character, responding to the situations around him, until finally driving the plot himself in the final act. So obviously, this is a very different take on the character, and I think that's okay, even if it feels a little strange at times.
How about we play this next hand with the Joker?
How about the Joker plays with you?
Most of the takes I've seen about this movie seem to believe it's a character study of a truly evil person, and to an extent that might be true, but Arthur is really the product of his environment, the city of Gotham. In fact, this is what he basically screams at TV host Murray Franklin in one of the film's most unsubtle moments. So let's talk about Gotham and the wealthy that reside over it. If I had one big criticism of Joker, it's that I think it lacks the complexity of King of Comedy or Taxi Driver in a pretty specific way. In an attempt to win sympathy over to Arthur, it really stacks the deck against him. The film opens with some kids stealing a sign and then brutally beating him. Why? Well, there's no real reason other than just sheer cruelty. By itself, this isn't too unbelievable, but that attitude runs throughout the whole movie. Nearly every character is just incredibly mean towards Arthur, who, especially early on, is just minding his own business. Almost no one but his coworker Gary is even polite to Arthur, let alone tries to make a real connection with him. His mother is hiding terrible secrets, his boss and other coworkers mock and manipulate him, random businessmen on the subway are ready to beat the crap out of him at like the drop of a hat. His only real relationship is very obviously a hallucination. It's pretty bleak, and I think that might make things a little too black and white. The movie kind of makes it clear that Arthur's social isolation isn't really his fault. It's that almost everyone in his life is uncaring and awful. Compare this to The King of Comedy, which Joker takes a ton of inspiration from. That movie is about an awkward misfit named Rupert Pupkin, played by Robert De Niro, who is obsessed with a specific TV host and with becoming a famous, respected comedian. Like Arthur, Rupert lives alone with his mother and doesn't have any real friends, and people often belittle and mock him. But unlike Arthur, Rupert's world isn't completely hopeless. He actually gets a woman who works at the TV network to listen to his comedy, which she compliments, saying that if he practices his craft at more clubs, he really has a shot to make a career out of it. But this isn't good enough for Rupert, who isn't really interested in the actual work of being a comedian so much as he wants the fame and respect that comes with being on TV. So we feel bad for Rupert, but we also know that the depressing life he leads is at least partially of his own making. I mean, even Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver is shown more kindness than Arthur, with Betsy being willing to go on a date with him until he manages to be a huge creep and scares her away. Arthur has none of that. His world is a bit more cartoonishly awful and a little less complex, but at least that's done with a very clear purpose in mind, and one that I actually find really interesting. Joaquin Phoenix's performance is great and all, but I actually think the best thing about this movie is how it recontextualizes the Wayne family. In film at least, Thomas Wayne has almost always been portrayed as a benevolent billionaire, a city leader with lofty ideals and a habit of making speeches to his young son about their responsibility to Gotham City. What I love about Joker's version of the character is that it's very true to that while also flipping it on its head. Thomas still makes lofty speeches, but there's a condescension and arrogance behind almost every word. This self-appointed savior talks about Gotham's poorest residents like they're trash, and then seems shocked when they don't respond well to that. We see just how different his life is from any normal person in the city. When Arthur visits the Wayne estate, the color palette of the film changes from the almost apocalyptic and sickly yellow and reds of the city to a more serene blue and green, all locked behind their gate. Again, this isn't the most subtle stuff. The movie even has a social worker tell Arthur point blank that those in charge don't care about people like him, as he loses his access to mental health care treatment due to budget cuts. But I think its bluntness actually works really well here. I mean, no one goes into a movie about the Joker expecting subtlety. I was kind of impressed by this movie's willingness to make monsters out of the Wayne family, considering Batman's got a movie right around the corner, and he is DC's golden goose. And that plays into another plot too. The idea of the Joker secretly being related to Bruce Wayne seems like it should be laughable, but I think it works surprisingly well here. Partially because it's played with a lot of ambiguity. Is Thomas Wayne Arthur's real father? It does seem a little unlikely. His mother's unending admiration and fixation on Wayne after all these years is a little stalkerish. Still, the film leaves open the possibility, with Arthur finding a picture of his mom with a note from Thomas on the back. And stuff like forging adoption papers or even getting a woman committed to an institution are probably well within the bounds of what the powerful and influential Wayne family could get away with. But whether it's true or not is almost beside the point, because either way it adds up to one of the key ideas of the movie. That Arthur and the Waynes occupy completely different worlds. Where he's discarded and abandoned by society pretty much since birth, they're basically treated as royalty. And yeah, I did say society in my review of Joker, sorry. But of course, I can't go this entire video without mentioning Robert De Niro's performance. I mean, between this and November's The Irishman, he seems to be having a pretty great fall. I love De Niro's casting here and how it perfectly echoes and flips his role in King of Comedy. Seriously, even his slightly hacky joke delivery feels exactly like Rupert Pupkin's material at the end of that film. He perfectly fits the mold of an old-fashioned late-night host. Guys like Johnny Carson and Dick Cavett, who are more about old-school jokey monologues and laid-back long interviews than, I don't know, playing beer pong with celebrities or whatever those shows do now. Like Thomas Wayne, there's always a hint of condescension to the way he interacts with his audience. And to me, his final scene is the most memorable of the movie. I mean, it's Phoenix and De Niro on screen together, so that's guaranteed to be interesting, but more importantly, I like that they're both kind of right here. Murray is correct when he says that no amount of self-pity can justify the murders that Arthur has confessed to, and Arthur is right when he says that they only brought him on the show as a cruel joke. Now, Arthur's crimes are much, much worse than Murray's, but the talk show host's willingness to book a guest who is clearly a desperate, mentally ill man just to mock him is another example of the powerful in this film treating those they view as beneath them like garbage. The exact attitude that causes so much anger and resentment, and that ultimately boils over and leads to the riots at the end of the film. This isn't to say that anything Arthur does is right. It isn't, obviously. But the film views Arthur as a monster of Gotham's own creation, not an evil genius completely acting outside the system, as the Joker is usually portrayed. The Waynes meet their inevitable death at the end of Joker, in a way that I thought was kind of dull and obvious at first. But the more I thought about it, the more I was surprised by how many interesting questions that raised about Batman himself. This is obviously the event that begins Bruce's transformation into the vigilante. But how he remembers his father, likely similar to the way he's been shown in most Batman media, kind, caring, Gotham savior, and how we, the audience, understand Thomas are two very different things. Now, does that mean the Dark Knight begins his career based on a lie, like a child's understanding of who his parents were? And if so, does that matter? Look, this is really geeky stuff, but I gotta say, I find it a lot more interesting than like countless comic book Easter eggs and name drops would have been, which Joker barely indulges in at all.
Hey Joker, a battering surprise! Missed me, time for a change.
In the end, I don't think Joker is quite at the level of a Taxi Driver or a King of Comedy, but that doesn't mean it isn't worthy in its own right. I'm really enjoying this new trend of DC movies that just kind of throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. And that director-driven approach really paid off here, giving us one of the most thought-provoking and well-acted comic book movies in years, if not exactly the most subtle. Now, I can't see this Joker facing off against the Batman, but that doesn't mean this wasn't a story worth telling. Batman and his villains have been reinterpreted over and over again through the years, often getting darker in the process. And if you're as interested in that process as I am, I really recommend The Caped Crusade by Glenn Weldon. Weldon does a great job of tracing the history of the Dark Knight through all the highs and lows of comic book, TV, and film history, and I think it'll be really interesting to just about any Bat fan out there, and you can listen to it for free right now on Audible. I've been a member for years because whether it's nonfiction, a great fantasy story, true crime, or just about anything else, I'm gonna find it on Audible. Not to mention you get 1 audiobook and 2 Audible originals for free every single month. A deal I've been taking advantage of a lot lately because their originals list is pretty insane. They have a ton of unique stuff that you're only going to find on there, and there's always something new to look forward to. So go to audible.com/midnight or text midnight to 500-500 to try it for free for 30 days. That's audible.com/midnight or text midnight to 500-500 and start listening today.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts.